Keanu Reeves stood at the counter, a regular customer at a cafe tucked away in a corner of a quiet, forgotten part of the city. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to see someone like him, Hollywood's go-to action hero. He was in his usual hoodie and sunglasses, trying his best to be invisible, just another face among the few who knew how to appreciate a decent espresso. The barista behind the counter nodded politely when he ordered, as if she didn't have to stifle a grin when she recognized him. The place was half empty, save for a woman in the corner who was quietly reading a book, and a boy who had just walked in, looking like he'd been through hell. He was younger than you'd expect, no more than 16, maybe. His clothes were torn, shoes ragged, and he looked completely out of place in this somewhat upscale neighborhood. His hair was unkempt, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. He looked like someone who was about to crack. The moment the door closed behind him, it was like the weight of his presence added an extra layer of tension to the air, the kind you couldn't ignore, even if you tried. He looked straight at the barista and then back to the door, like he was afraid of something, of someone chasing him. And then he opened his mouth, voice shaking. "I need help." It wasn't loud, but it was clear. People looked up. The woman reading her book glanced over the top of her glasses. The barista froze for just a moment, and Keanu, ever the observer, took a subtle step back, watching with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his eyes focused on the kid. The boy stepped closer to the counter, his breath shallow, panic rising in his chest. "Please, I don't know where to go. I just need a ride to the hospital. My mom, she's sick. I don't know how to get there. I don't have any money, but I'll pay you back. I promise. I'll work for it. His words broke, his voice cracking in the middle of the sentence. "I just don't know what to do anymore." The barista, who had been staring at him like he was some nuisance, rolled her eyes. "Yeah, sure, kid. That's exactly what we need." Another charity case asking for handouts. She let out a sharp laugh, more out of annoyance than humor. The woman reading the book didn't even look up, too engrossed in her page, while Keanu, standing off to the side, felt a pang of something, a flash of empathy, maybe, or a flicker of memory from a time when life fell out of control. The boy, not one to give up easily, shifted from foot to foot, eyes pleading, looking desperate, his hands twitching by his sides, as if he couldn't decide whether to reach for something or run out the door. "I swear, I just need to get to the hospital. She's alone, and He stopped, like he couldn't finish the thought. "I don't know what to do anymore. Please." The barista, still clearly annoyed, leaned over the counter, crossing her arms. "Yeah, well, not everyone's gonna swoop in and save the day, kid. Maybe you should have thought about that before you ran off, wherever you're coming from." The boy's face fell. He looked around, his shoulders slumping. You could see the weight of the world on him now, every ounce of his frustration finally bubbling to the surface. His mouth opened to argue back, but then Keanu moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. He stepped toward the boy, his movements slow, deliberate, as if giving him time to back off if he wanted to, but the boy just stood there, eyes wide, still shaking, still desperate. Keanu looked at the barista, his voice calm, but firm. "I'll help him." The barista blinked, stunned for a second, before she recovered, her eyes narrowing. "What? You're going to take him to the hospital yourself? You think we don't have real customers waiting for their coffee? Don't expect a medal for playing the hero." Keanu's eyes stayed on the boy as he spoke, his tone steady, even kind. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I'm just someone who knows what it's like to feel lost." He turned back to the kid, who seemed frozen, almost too scared to believe what was happening. Keanu gave him a soft nod, the kind of reassuring gesture that said everything without speaking. "Let's go." The room was silent, save for the hum of the espresso machine in the background, the sound of the barista clicking her tongue in annoyance, and the faint rustling of the pages as the woman tried to ignore the scene unfolding in front of her. The boy, wide-eyed, took a hesitant step forward, then another, like he couldn't quite process that someone, a total stranger, was willing to help him. Keanu, without a second thought, turned to the door, the boy following closely behind. Before they could leave, the barista called out, her words bitter and sharp. "Hope you know what you're doing," she sneered, But Keanu didn't answer her. His eyes were already on the kid, his focus unwavering. The boy, who had come in looking like he had nothing left to give, now had someone beside him who made him believe, even just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way out. And as the door closed behind them, the weight of the world that had seemed to rest on the boy's shoulders just a moment before seemed to lift, if only for a little while. Keanu didn't say anything as they walked through the door, the cold wind of the street pushing in like it was trying to remind them of the world outside, of the people who would never understand why they were out here, why they were doing what they were doing. The boy, still struggling to catch his breath, kept his head down, hands jammed into the pockets of his jacket. Keanu noticed the way his fingers clenched around nothing, like he was holding onto whatever hope he had left. They didn't speak. No comforting words, no attempts at light conversation. Keanu didn't need to say much. In his silence, the boy started to breathe easier, like he could finally think without someone looking at him, judging him, making him feel like he was some kind of burden. They walked together down the street, not fast, not slow, just steady. It wasn't far to the boy's destination. Keanu knew the area. The hospital wasn't exactly the nicest in town, but it was a place where people went when they didn't have other options. The boy had stopped looking up, his feet dragging along the pavement, eyes still fixed on the ground ahead of him. But Keanu could see it, the worry eating away at him, the fear of not getting there fast enough, of not getting there at all. Keanu's mind wandered briefly, pulling him to places he hadn't thought about in years. He had always tried to keep his past tucked away, kept in the shadows where it didn't feel like it could pull him back down again. But today, seeing this boy, this kid who had no one, was like looking into a mirror he hadn't wanted to stare into. He wondered if the boy had ever felt like he was on his own, like everything in the world was falling apart, and there was no one left to catch him. Keanu wasn't sure if he had the right words for it, but in that moment, the connection felt like it ran deeper than just the two of them walking side by side. The boy finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" His words didn't carry the suspicion of someone who had lived a life filled with broken promises or false hopes. He sounded tired, as if the question had been asked too many times before, and he didn't really expect an answer. Keanu slowed down, just a fraction, his steps becoming more deliberate as he processed the question. It wasn't hard to figure out why the boy had asked. Keanu wasn't a stranger to the world that made people skeptical of kindness, especially when it came from someone who seemed to have everything. But his answer wasn't about trying to ease the boy's doubts. It was simpler than that. It was the kind of honesty that only came when you'd lived long enough to see the world for what it truly was, with all its imperfections. "I've been there," he said softly, not looking at the boy, but his voice holding a quiet gravity. "I know what it's like to feel like you've got nowhere left to turn." There was no need to elaborate. Keanu knew the boy didn't need his life story, didn't need to hear about all the moments he had screwed up, the times he had failed to be the person he thought he was supposed to be. The boy didn't need a lecture, didn't need some idealistic speech about how life always turned around. Keanu simply needed the kid to know that he understood. The boy shifted his weight, still walking, but with less urgency. The tension in his body had lessened, just a bit. "I don't know if I can do this," he muttered, barely audible. His voice cracked at the end of the sentence, like it had been stretched too thin. "You can," Keanu answered, his voice steady. "You just have to keep going, even when it feels like you can't." The boy nodded, but Keanu could tell he wasn't convinced. He knew better than anyone that words were often just words. What really mattered was what came after. It wasn't easy to believe in something when life kept telling you the opposite. But Keanu had learned to take each step, no matter how small, even when the world around him didn't make sense. They reached the hospital entrance in less than 15 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Keanu could feel the boy's energy shift, the weight of reality crashing back down on him the moment they stepped through the doors. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the harsh lights above made everything seem a little too bright, too clinical. The boy's grip on his jacket tightened again as they walked through the lobby, his eyes scanning the room for anyone who might stop him, anyone who might tell him he didn't belong here, didn't deserve to be here. Keanu's steps were sure, calm, his presence a quiet reassurance that helped the boy hold it together for just a little while longer. But when they reached the reception desk, the nurse behind the counter didn't even look up at them at first. She was busy tapping away on her computer, her face a mask of indifference. Keanu stood there for a moment, watching her, and then the boy cleared his throat, his voice trembling. I'm looking for my mom. She's in a room. Her name is Sarah Collins." The nurse finally glanced up, her eyes narrowing as if she was trying to place the boy's face. "Do you have an ID or anything that proves you're—" "I don't have anything," the boy cut in, his voice louder now, his frustration rising. "I just need to see her. Please." The nurse sighed, her patience worn thin. "You're going to have to fill out some forms. I can't just—" Before she could finish, Keanu stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "She's his mom. I'm here with him." He didn't offer any explanation, didn't try to sell her on a sob story. He just said it like it was a fact that didn't need any validation. The nurse hesitated, and then, with a reluctant sigh, she pushed the computer screen aside, reaching for a clipboard. "Fine," she muttered, "but I need you to sign this and wait in the designated area." The boy's eyes were wide, as if he had just been handed a lifeline, but Keanu could see that he was still scared. He wasn't sure if it was the hospital or the uncertainty of what would happen when he saw his mother that was eating away at him, but it didn't matter. Keanu stayed beside him, the silent strength he offered enough for now. The boy filled out the forms quickly, his hand shaking as he scribbled down the information. He looked up at Keanu, unsure of what to say, and Keanu just nodded, giving him the space to breathe. It was up to the boy now. Keanu had done what he could. He had shown up, and that was more than most people ever did. They waited for what felt like an eternity before the nurse finally gestured toward the elevator, her voice detached. "Room 402. Take the elevator on your left." The boy nodded, his eyes never leaving Keanu's as they walked toward the elevator. There was a brief moment where Keanu considered saying something else, offering more words of comfort, but he knew that wasn't what the boy needed. Not anymore. Instead, he simply watched as the kid stepped onto the elevator, the doors closing with a soft ping, leaving Keanu alone in the hospital lobby. Keanu stood in the lobby for a moment after the elevator doors closed, the echo of its descent still ringing in his ears. He could feel the weight of the silence in the air, the kind that pressed down on everything, made the space feel smaller than it was. He didn't move, just stayed there, his hands in the pockets of his hoodie, his mind racing in quiet circles. He had done what he came here to do. He had helped the boy when he needed it most, taken a step that wasn't about fame or charity, but something real. But now that he was alone, in the sterile quiet of the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done more, said more, like there was a piece of the puzzle that he hadn't been able to reach. He looked around the empty waiting area. No one else was here. Not that it mattered. The world outside still kept spinning, and Keanu wasn't sure if he felt like a part of it anymore. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a woman's voice behind him, distant, but growing closer. It was a soft voice, hesitant, like she wasn't sure whether she was speaking too loudly or in the wrong space. "Excuse me," she said. Keanu turned slowly, glancing over his shoulder, and found a woman standing at the door to the waiting area. She was maybe in her 40s, dressed in a black coat with a scarf wrapped around her neck. Her hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and her expression was tired, worn. Her eyes looked like they'd seen things, hard things, and had gotten used to it. She wasn't looking at him like the nurse had. No judgment, no surprise. She was just looking at him, like she needed to say something. "Yes?" Keanu asked, his voice neutral, polite, but not necessarily inviting. He wasn't sure what kind of interaction she wanted, but he was willing to listen. The woman took a couple of steps forward, hesitant, but there was something about the way she held herself, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to ask for help, but knew she had no other choice. "I saw you with a boy." She glanced toward the elevator, and then back at him, as if checking to make sure she wasn't making some kind of mistake. "You're not." She stopped, clearly thinking, recalculating her words. "You're not related, are you?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. Keanu frowned, shifting slightly on his feet. "No," he said, shaking his head. I'm just helping him out. His voice was calm, but he could feel the edge of his words, like he was trying to convince himself more than her. The woman nodded slowly, as if processing that answer, but it didn't seem to fully register with her. She took another step closer, her eyes still locked on him. I'm his mom, she said, and then paused, like the words weighed more than they should have. Sarah, I'm his mother. Keanu blinked at her, taken aback for a second. He hadn't expected this. He had assumed the boy's mom was the one in the hospital room, but hearing it from this woman, this fragile-looking stranger, shifted the entire context of the situation. She was trembling, barely holding herself together. Her face was drawn, her eyes red, as if she hadn't slept in days, or maybe longer. Where is he? She asked, her voice cracking, a sharp edge of panic in it. She wasn't looking at Keanu anymore. She was scanning the area like she expected him to appear any second, like she could somehow summon him with enough desperation. Keanu looked at the floor for a moment, not sure how to answer. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't in charge of anyone's care. He had just been the guy who'd walked into a cafe at the wrong time and made a choice to stand beside a kid who had nobody. He's at the room now, he said, trying to sound reassuring. Room 402. The woman nodded, her breath catching. She swayed slightly, like she might lose her balance, but caught herself against the wall. Keanu wasn't sure whether it was the exhaustion, the pain, or just the overwhelming weight of everything, but the way she looked like the world was falling apart around her made him want to do more, to somehow fix it for her. But there was nothing to fix, not yet, anyway. I was supposed to be there, Sarah said softly, more to herself than to him. Her voice was barely a whisper now. I should have been there for him. I should have. She stopped, like she couldn't finish the thought. Her hands were trembling now, gripping the edge of her coat. But I couldn't. I couldn't make it. Keanu could feel the guilt, the grief in her words, the way they hung in the air. He had no idea what she was going through. He didn't know what it was like to lose control of everything, to be powerless to help someone you loved. He wanted to say something, anything, to help her understand that sometimes life was just unfair. But instead, he stayed quiet, just waiting for her to find her own words. After a long, drawn-out silence, Sarah finally looked up at him, her eyes wide, full of questions she wasn't sure how to ask. Who are you? She asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Keanu hesitated for a moment. There were a lot of answers he could give, a lot of ways to explain who he was. He could tell her that he was just a guy, just someone who saw someone in need and decided to help, but he knew that wasn't enough. He had always struggled with who he was in the eyes of others. People had their own ideas about him, but they didn't really know him. None of them did. I'm just someone who could help, he said, his words simple as though that explained everything. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, still trying to piece together the fragments of their interaction. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. And then, for the first time since Keanu had met her, she smiled. A small, fragile thing, but it was there. Thank you, she said softly, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Thank you for helping my son. Keanu nodded once, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't sure what else to say. He wasn't a hero, wasn't the answer to anyone's problems. He was just a guy who had done one thing right today. And maybe that was enough. The moment stretched out, the hospital's buzzing lights flickering above them. But Keanu didn't feel the need to say anything else. Sometimes, silence was the only thing that could hold a moment together. The woman had her own battle to fight, but maybe, just maybe, this small act of kindness would make a difference. Maybe it wouldn't solve everything, but it would make it just a little bit easier to breathe. Keanu stood there, feeling a strange kind of discomfort creeping in as the woman thanked him again, her voice quiet but full of sincerity. It was the kind of moment that should have felt fulfilling, the kind of thing that made you walk away feeling like you'd done something worthwhile. But it didn't feel like that at all. It felt unfinished, like there was still something else, something more that he wasn't seeing. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe it was because, even though Sarah had thanked him, he still had no idea what would happen next. It wasn't as if her son would walk out of the hospital cured, her life magically fixed. She wasn't going to leave here without scars, without questions, without pain. And neither was the boy. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It wasn't that late, but the hospital's quiet hum made it feel like the world had slowed down, like time was stretching out longer than it should. He knew he could leave now, just walk out and leave it all behind, like he had done so many times before, but this wasn't the same. This wasn't just another moment where he could check off the help someone box and go back to his life. It was something different, and it gnawed at him in a way he couldn't ignore. "Are you okay?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, drawing his attention back to her. She was still standing there, her expression hesitant. She had stopped crying, but her eyes still held that same exhaustion, the kind of tiredness that went beyond physical fatigue. Keanu glanced down at the floor, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah," he said, trying to keep the answer simple. But he knew it was more complicated than that. "Just trying to figure out what to do next, I guess." She seemed to understand, or at least she didn't press him for details. There was an understanding there, an unspoken agreement between them that neither of them had the answers. Her shoulders slumped slightly, like the weight of her own uncertainty was too much to bear. She cleared her throat softly. "I don't know if I'm doing enough for him, you know? I don't know if I can fix things." Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and for a brief second, Keanu saw her as more than just a woman who was grieving. He saw her as someone who was doing everything she could, even if it didn't feel like it was enough. "You don't have to fix everything," he said before he could stop himself. He didn't know why he'd said it, but the words were out there now. Sometimes, just showing up is enough. That's more than a lot of people ever do. Her eyes softened as she absorbed his words, her face a mixture of surprise and gratitude, as if she hadn't expected anyone to speak to her like that. "I wish it felt like enough," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like the words were a secret she hadn't wanted to admit to anyone. "I feel like I'm failing him. I let him down so many times." Keanu could feel the rawness of her pain, the vulnerability she was exposing without even realizing it. He understood that. There were times in his own life when he'd felt like he had failed, like the weight of everything he hadn't done was too much to carry. But he had learned that sometimes it wasn't about getting everything perfect. It was about being there, even when you didn't know how to make it better. And he needed her to understand that, even if she couldn't see it herself. "You're here now," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're not failing him. You're showing up, and that's what counts. That's what he needs." Sarah didn't say anything for a long time. She just stood there, her fingers curling into the fabric of her coat, her eyes far away. Keanu could see the internal struggle playing out in her, the part of her that felt like she wasn't doing enough, and the part that wanted to believe that just being there was enough. He didn't know what the future would hold for her or for her son, but he knew this was the moment that could shape it. She finally broke the silence, her voice low but steady. "I don't know what I would have done without you today," she said, and her words were quiet, but they held a weight that almost made Keanu wish he could take them back. It wasn't because he didn't appreciate them. It was just that he had done something so small, so insignificant, that it didn't feel like it should deserve this kind of gratitude. Before he could answer, the elevator doors opened again, and the boy appeared, stepping out with his head down, his hands still shoved deep into his pockets. He looked smaller now, somehow, like the weight of whatever had happened in that room had drained him, taken something from him that Keanu couldn't see. But when the boy's eyes met Sarah's, something shifted in his posture. He straightened up just a little, the tiniest movement, but it was enough to make Keanu notice. "Mom," the boy said softly, his voice uncertain. He stopped just a few feet away from her, like he wasn't sure if it was okay to get too close. He was still trying to read the situation, trying to figure out what to do next, but his voice held a kind of tenderness that Keanu hadn't heard before. Sarah didn't hesitate. She moved toward him in one swift motion, wrapping her arms around him, pulling him into a hug that looked almost fragile, like it might break at any moment. "You're here," she whispered into his hair, her voice breaking with relief. "You're here." Keanu took a step back, not wanting to intrude on their moment. He couldn't help but feel like he had done all he could do. His presence had been a quiet reassurance, a reminder that there were still people out there willing to help. But it wasn't about him anymore. It was about them, about the connection they had, about the bond between a mother and her son that nothing could take away. For a moment, he just stood there, watching them. It was almost too personal to witness, too intimate, like he was seeing something that wasn't meant to be shared. But he stayed, because he couldn't bring himself to walk away just yet. He knew it wasn't his place to stay forever, but in this moment, he wasn't sure he was ready to leave. Sarah pulled away from her son and looked at Keanu, her eyes soft now, almost searching. I don't know how to thank you, she said quietly. Keanu shook his head, stepping toward the door. You don't have to, he said with a faint smile. Just take care of each other. He paused at the door, glancing back one last time, and saw the boy's eyes, still tired, still uncertain, but holding on to something now. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the beginning of healing. Keanu left the hospital and stepped into the cold night air. The world hadn't changed, but maybe, just maybe, he had done something that mattered. Not a grand gesture, not a life-altering miracle, but something simple, something real. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him anymore. Maybe that was enough for tonight. Keanu stepped into the cold air outside the hospital, his breath misting in front of him as he adjusted the collar of his jacket. It was one of those nights where the city felt impossibly still, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. He didn't know if it was just the quiet of the moment or if something had shifted inside him, but everything seemed a little too sharp, a little too clear. The soft hum of traffic in the distance, the occasional sound of footsteps, the chill in the air, all of it seemed more significant than it should. As he walked down the street, his thoughts were tangled, still lingering on the brief conversation he'd had with Sarah and her son. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he was supposed to understand, some kind of deeper meaning he wasn't seeing. He had helped them, yes. He had done what he could, but it didn't feel like enough. There was no neat resolution here. The world didn't fix itself just because one person stepped in to help. People didn't change that easily. And sometimes, the best you could do was to make someone feel less alone in a moment of desperation. But he still couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he hadn't done enough. He turned the corner, heading toward his car, when a voice called out to him from behind. Hey, are you Keanu Reeves? The voice was hesitant, almost apologetic, as if the speaker wasn't sure if they were interrupting something important or making a mistake. Keanu paused mid-step, turning around to find a young man standing a few feet away from him. He looked to be in his late 20s, wearing a worn-out hoodie and jeans. His face was familiar, but not from any movies or anything. This was just an ordinary guy, someone who clearly wasn't used to approaching people like Keanu. Keanu raised an eyebrow, already feeling the usual mix of curiosity and caution that came with being recognized. Yeah, that's me, he said, keeping his tone polite but casual. The last thing he wanted was to make the guy uncomfortable, but he was also keenly aware of how strange these interactions could get. The young man hesitated for a moment, as though unsure what to say next, then finally stepped closer. I just wanted to say that I'm a huge fan. You've been through a lot in your life, you know. The young man's voice was full of admiration, but there was something else in his eyes too, something that made Keanu pause. It wasn't just hero worship or the typical "I love your movies" spiel. There was a kind of raw honesty there, an earnestness that made the whole situation feel more real, less like the usual scripted fan interaction. Keanu gave a small smile. Thanks, I appreciate that, he said, taking a moment to study the guy. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like he could read more in his eyes than the usual fan, who saw nothing but the man on the screen. This guy was different. The young man shifted on his feet, clearly still gathering his thoughts. After a beat, he spoke again, his voice quieter now, like he was wrestling with something he wasn't sure he wanted to say out loud. You know, he started his words coming slower this time. I've been going through some things. He glanced at the ground, almost as though embarrassed by the admission. Keanu's brow furrowed slightly. He wasn't sure what the guy meant, but the unease in his tone was clear. It's been tough. A lot of stuff I can't. I don't know. It just feels like everything's falling apart, you know? Keanu nodded, not sure how to respond. He had heard this kind of thing before, but the weight in the guy's voice was different. It wasn't just a complaint or a plea for attention. There was something raw, something he couldn't ignore. The young man shifted his weight again, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets as he looked up at Keanu. You've probably heard this a million times, but it's like you're the only one who really gets it. The young man's eyes were searching Keanu's face now, like he was hoping to find something there, something that would make everything make sense again. You've been through a lot, right? All that stuff, and you still kept going. You didn't give up. How do you do it? Keanu took a deep breath, the weight of the question landing on his chest. He could see the vulnerability in the young man's eyes, and it reminded him of how he felt when he was in his early 20s, trying to make sense of the world around him. How do you keep going when everything seems like it's falling apart? How do you find the strength to keep pushing forward when there's nothing left to hold on to? The answer wasn't something he could sum up in a quick sentence, and he wasn't sure what the guy expected. But there was something in the simplicity of the question that hit harder than he was prepared for. I don't know, Keanu finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. I think you just do. You take it one day at a time. It doesn't always get easier, but you find reasons to keep going. Even if you don't understand why, you just keep moving forward. The young man stared at him, taking in the words, like he was trying to digest them, trying to make sense of them. There was a long pause before he spoke again, his voice a little less sure this time. I don't know if I can, he said, his shoulders slumping slightly. The despair in his voice was unmistakable. It just feels like everything's been going wrong. Like no matter how hard I try, nothing ever works out. Keanu shifted his weight, his eyes flicking to the street, then back to the guy. I've been there, he said, his voice softer now. I think we all have. We've all had those moments where it feels like you can't get back up. But the thing is, you don't have to do it all at once. You just take it one step at a time. Even if it's a small step, it's a step. And sometimes that's enough. The young man seemed to mull over his words for a moment, his gaze dropping to the sidewalk. Keanu could see the tension in his body, the struggle, but there was something else there, too. Something that hadn't been there when they first spoke. It wasn't a sudden shift, but something had clicked in his mind. Maybe it was the fact that someone, a stranger, was willing to listen, to share a piece of himself. You really think so? The young man asked, his voice quieter now, but a hint of hope starting to creep into his words. Keanu nodded. Yeah, I do. I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe it. Life doesn't have to be perfect, man. It just has to be lived. There was a long moment of silence between them. The young man finally looked up, meeting Keanu's gaze again. This time, there was something different in his eyes, something a little less heavy. Maybe it was a spark of understanding, or maybe it was just the fact that someone had taken a moment to speak to him like he mattered. Either way, Keanu knew this conversation wasn't going to be forgotten. Thanks, the young man said, his voice more solid now. Really? I think I needed to hear that. Keanu gave him a small, reassuring smile. Anytime, he said, and turned to walk away. As he got in his car and drove away, Keanu couldn't help but wonder if these brief moments, these fleeting connections with strangers, were the things that really mattered. He hadn't saved anyone tonight, hadn't fixed anyone's life. But sometimes that wasn't what people needed. Sometimes, all you needed was someone who listened. Maybe that was enough after all. Keanu couldn't sleep that night. The streets outside his apartment were quiet, the kind of quiet that made it seem like the city itself had decided to hit pause. It was one of those nights where your thoughts seemed to echo too loud in the silence. He rolled over in bed, pulling the covers tighter around his shoulders, but no matter how he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. There were moments in his life when he felt disconnected, when everything felt distant and blurry, but this was different. This time, it wasn't about the isolation he'd grown accustomed to. It was about the idea that there was something more, something waiting to happen, but he couldn't figure out what it was. The conversation with the young man earlier had left him thinking, replaying their words in his mind like a song that wouldn't stop looping. Keanu had always been a private person, not one to open up easily, but for some reason, talking to that guy had felt different. It had felt real in a way that was hard to explain, like the kind of conversation that left you changed, even if you didn't know how or why. And now, Hours later, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He kept wondering if it had made any difference, if the guy had taken anything away from their exchange. Maybe it didn't matter, maybe it wasn't his place to fix things for strangers, but that didn't stop him from wondering. He had told the guy to keep going, to keep taking small steps, but Keanu didn't even know if he believed it himself. He slid out of bed, the cool floor against his bare feet, grounding him for a moment as he walked over to the window. The city below was a grid of lights, people moving in and out of their lives, living out moments Keanu would never witness. It felt like everyone was moving forward, living their lives with a clarity that he was lacking, and the feeling of being adrift in his own world made him restless. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass, trying to clear his mind, but it wasn't working. The phone in his pocket buzzed, breaking his thoughts, and for a moment he almost didn't check it. But then he pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize, but the words on the screen caught his attention right away. "I need to talk to you. I don't know who else to turn to." Keanu stared at the message, his thumb hovering over the screen for a long time before he typed a simple reply. "Who is this?" There was a brief pause before the phone buzzed again. "It's the guy from earlier. The one you talked to. I don't know if you remember, but you said something to me that made me feel, I don't know, like I could maybe do something with all the crap in my life. I don't know how to explain it." Keanu felt a flicker of something inside him, something between hope and confusion. He hadn't expected to hear from the guy again, and he definitely hadn't expected him to reach out like this. It wasn't the kind of thing Keanu was used to. But there was something in the message that made him feel like this wasn't just a fleeting moment for the young man. After another beat, Keanu typed back, "What happened?" The reply came quickly, almost urgently. "I don't know. I thought about what you said. I really did. I thought maybe I could keep going. But tonight, I was thinking of just throwing it all away. I was just about to make a decision, you know? And then I remembered what you said, that you just take it one day at a time. I don't know what's stopping me from going through with it now. But I guess I don't want to give up yet." Keanu felt a tightness in his chest as he read the message. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't known what to expect, really, but this felt like more than just a simple thank you. The guy wasn't asking for answers. He was asking for something else entirely. He was asking for someone to listen, and Keanu knew what that felt like. There had been so many times in his life when he had felt lost, when he'd wished for someone to just hear him out, without judgment, without advice. Just to be there. Keanu sat down on the edge of his bed, his mind working through the situation. It was late. It was probably too late for a phone call, but there was something about the urgency in the message that made him want to reach out. So he hit the dial button without thinking twice. The phone rang a few times before the young man picked up. "Hello." His voice sounded thick, like he had been crying, or at least on the verge of it. Keanu cleared his throat. "Hey, it's Keanu." He heard the young man take a sharp breath, and then silence. Keanu could almost feel the weight of that silence, like the air itself had frozen in that moment. You actually called," the young man said, his voice barely audible. Keanu nodded, even though the guy couldn't see him. "Yeah, I said I would. I'm here." There was a pause on the other end, like the young man was still processing the fact that Keanu was taking him seriously. Then the voice on the other end spoke again, quieter this time. "I don't know what to do anymore. It feels like everything's just a mess. My life, my choices, everything. I don't know how to fix it. I keep trying, but I keep failing." Keanu leaned back against the wall, his fingers running through his hair as he listened. It wasn't a story he hadn't heard before, but hearing it from this guy, after their brief conversation earlier, felt different. It felt real, like this wasn't just some random phone call. This was someone who was reaching out because they needed something they couldn't get on their own. "You don't need to fix everything all at once," Keanu said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper, like he was trying to give this person the space to understand. "It's okay to take it slow, to make mistakes. You don't have to have it all figured out today. You just have to keep showing up, even when it's hard." "I don't know if I can," the young man responded, his voice cracking slightly. "I just don't know if it's worth it anymore." Keanu's heart tightened at the words. He had heard people say things like that before, and he had been there himself. That dark place where everything felt pointless, where every step forward seemed like a futile attempt. He knew it, but he also knew something else, that it was never about being perfect. It was about staying in the game, even when the odds felt insurmountable. "It's worth it," Keanu said, his voice firm, like he wasn't going to let the young man believe anything else. "It's worth it because you're still here. You're still fighting. And that's more than a lot of people can say. You don't have to know how it's going to turn out. You just have to keep going." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Keanu wasn't sure if the guy had hung up or if he was still listening. Finally, the young man spoke again, his voice quieter but more composed. "Thank you," he said simply. And that was it. Keanu sat there for a while after the call ended, his phone resting in his hand. It was a small conversation, nothing monumental, but it felt like the kind of conversation that could make a difference. One step at a time. He didn't have all the answers, but maybe, just maybe, that was okay. Keanu sat on his couch for a long time after the call, staring out at the dimly lit street. It felt like something had shifted, but he couldn't quite pinpoint what. Maybe it was the rawness of the conversation, the weight of the words he'd shared. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that someone had reached out to him, vulnerable and open, trusting that he could offer something, anything. He wasn't sure if he'd made a real difference in that young man's life, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to forget it anytime soon. The night wore on, and Keanu couldn't sleep. He tried to distract himself by watching TV, but his mind kept drifting back to the call. He kept thinking about how quickly life could spiral out of control, how easy it was for someone to feel like they were on the verge of giving up. And yet, in that moment, a stranger had trusted him with their pain, and that trust had planted a seed of something that Keanu couldn't ignore. He didn't have answers for everything. He didn't have all the wisdom in the world. But he did know that sometimes just listening, just being there, could make all the difference. The next morning, Keanu woke up to another message from the young man. He wasn't sure what to expect, but when he opened it, he was surprised by what he read. It was brief, almost too short to grasp the weight of it. "I made it through the night. Thanks." Keanu stared at the message for a while, his mind racing. He'd known how fragile life could feel when you're caught in the middle of it, when things are tough and it feels like everything is falling apart. That text, just a few simple words, felt like a small victory, one that Keanu wasn't sure he deserved, but one that had made him feel like there was still hope in the world. For the rest of the day, Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that he had been a part of something important. His thoughts kept drifting back to that phone call, and as much as he tried to push it aside, he couldn't. Something about it had left a mark on him. He thought about how easy it was to slip into the mindset that no one cared, that your struggles were yours alone to carry. But here was this guy, someone he didn't even know, reaching out to him. It reminded him of how much impact even the smallest interactions could have. Later that afternoon, Keanu decided to go for a walk. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city streets. As he walked, he felt the weight of the world lifting a little bit, like the simple act of moving through the world, of stepping out into the open air, could somehow reset his mind. His footsteps echoed in the quiet of the evening, and for once, he wasn't rushing anywhere. He didn't have anywhere specific to go. He just needed to walk. As he rounded a corner, he noticed a man sitting on a bench nearby, his head bowed, hands clenched in his lap. The man looked disheveled, like he hadn't slept in days. Keanu slowed his pace, his instincts telling him to keep walking, but something inside him made him stop. Maybe it was the memory of the young man's voice, or maybe it was something else. But he found himself approaching the bench, standing a few feet away, unsure of what to say. The man looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, his face tired but open. He didn't seem surprised by Keanu's presence, as though he had been expecting someone to stop. There was a kind of weariness in his expression that made Keanu's chest tighten. The man didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, as though trying to read him, to figure out what this interaction meant. Keanu cleared his throat, the words coming out almost like a question. "Hey, are you okay?" The man blinked a few times, as if the question had caught him off guard. Then, without warning, he let out a deep sigh, his shoulders slumping as he spoke. "No, not really. Life's been a lot lately. I'm just stuck. Don't know what to do with it anymore." Keanu hesitated for a moment, but then took a step closer, sitting down on the bench beside the man. He didn't know why he was doing this. He didn't know why he had stopped or what he could offer this person. But something about him reminded him of the young man from the night before. He couldn't just keep walking past people. Not now. Not after everything. I hear you, Keanu said, his voice calm, steady. I get it. Sometimes life just piles up, and it feels like there's no way out. The man looked over at him, studying him for a moment before speaking again, his voice rough. Yeah, well, that's how it feels. Like no matter what I do, it's never enough. Nothing changes. Just keep waking up, doing the same thing, feeling like I'm stuck in a loop. Every day's the same. Keanu nodded, recognizing the exhaustion in the man's voice. I've been there. I think everyone has at some point. But it's important to remember that it doesn't have to stay that way. The man scoffed, the bitterness in his tone cutting through the air. Easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like. Keanu could feel the walls the man had built, the defenses that kept him from reaching out. It was the same kind of defense the young man had put up, the kind that made it hard to connect, hard to let anyone in. But Keanu knew this feeling, and he knew how to break it. He had to meet the man where he was, not where he wanted him to be. No, I don't know your exact situation, Keanu said, choosing his words carefully. But I know what it's like to feel stuck. I know what it's like to feel like things will never change. I know what it's like to wonder if it's even worth it to keep going. And I'm here to tell you that it is. It's always worth it. The man didn't say anything for a while. He just sat there, looking out at the street, his hands still clenched in his lap. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, though. It was the kind of silence that said everything without needing to be filled with words. Finally, after a long pause, the man spoke again. You really think so? Keanu looked at him, his gaze steady. I know so. The man exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging even further. But there was something different in his eyes now. A small flicker of something. Maybe hope. Maybe just the possibility of it. Keanu wasn't sure, but he knew it was enough. The man turned to him and, for the first time, smiled, small but real. Thanks, man. I don't know what to say, but thanks. Keanu gave him a nod, standing up from the bench. No need to thank me. Just take it one step at a time. As Keanu walked away, he felt something stir inside him. Maybe it was the start of something new. Maybe it was just the realization that we don't always have the answers, but sometimes we can offer the most important thing, our presence.